Developing a video game based on a movie franchise is never an easy task. Outside of the obvious challenges of game development, there's an additional challenge in managing existing fan expectations, which when examined are often vastly different from newcomers to the franchise. In other words, even if your game is a bona fide technical masterpiece, you're never going to please everyone. Now, in the case of Robocop Rogue City, developer Teon has struck a mostly balanced approach to delivering a modern shooter experience while doing a very good job of delivering fan service to series veterans. You're getting a faithful recreation of Detroit, all of your favourite characters from the movies, and even Peter Weller reprising his role as Robocop, which is probably one of the single biggest things which helps to elevate this from feeling like a video game to feeling like a video game in the Robocop universe. It is worth pointing out that this isn't the first time Robocop has graced our screens in a first-person shooting adventure, with the Titus Interactive title, simply named Robocop, releasing in 2003 to generally unfavourable reviews, with Electronic Gaming Monthly listing a positive of the game as it making Robocop 3 seem not half bad, and honestly that's all I need to read to know to avoid it. As always, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's follow our prime directives, grab our Auto 9 and head to Detroit to review Robocop Rogue City. As a fan of the Robocop movies, I was curious to see how the game approached its overall story, particularly given that the time period the game takes place in is directly after Robocop 2, which happens to be my favourite movie of the series. Now, I'm not going to go into any spoilers here, but effectively the game weaves together two narratives. There's a typical save the city from evil narrative, and then there's the actual Robocop, or Alex Murphy for those of you playing at home, narrative. The overall story presentation reminded me a lot of Deus Ex. There's a main storyline of saving the world, but then there's a much more personal story of Adam Jensen, just like there is with Alex Murphy. And it's perhaps this more personal story, which I think represents somewhat of a missed opportunity. Narratively, it's satisfying, but overall it plays it very safe and doesn't really take any narrative risks, which as a result mean that some of the payoffs don't feel as impactful as they could have. Regardless, both narrative elements are presented well, and while the main story isn't the most engaging I've played in recent times, for a movie to game adaptation, it's pretty good. Lastly, while I wouldn't say that you need to have watched the movies to enjoy the story here, as there is a lot of exposition throughout the narrative and overall environment, you're definitely going to appreciate it more if you have. Gameplay-wise, Rogue City is a difficult game to describe. It's part first-person shooter, part role-playing game, part puzzle game, and arguably part visual novel. It's a really interesting mix of a game, and what's more interesting is that it's all fairly well balanced in overall execution. Now, the combat is arguably what most people are here for, and overall it's really good. When I first saw some of the early development footage, I was really concerned about how control and movement would be handled, given the rather robotic nature of Robocop. You know, you don't exactly see him circle strafing around in the movies. However, the developers have done a really good job of making Robocop feel mobile enough to support the combat game loop, while adding other systems to help offset the lack of mobility. For example, while many first-person shooters leverage mobility and cover systems, Robocop turns this on its head and leverages resilience and aggression. You will take damage, but a fairly generous health bar and a recharging health system help to offset the handicap of not having the more traditional damage avoidance mechanics in place. There are definitely elements of an on-rails experience in the combat mechanics, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, more on this later. Now, when you're not in a combat zone, the game switches to more of a role-playing game, with Robocop able to accept side quests, many of which are non-violent, and completing them earns additional XP, which in turn can be converted into upgrades to be used in combat. You also accumulate XP by completing the main story missions, but if you want to unlock things at a much faster rate, the side quests are the way to go. One of the areas the movies didn't really touch on was life outside of the main characters or main set pieces. You kind of just had to use your imagination for what the rest of the world was like. However, here you get to experience it all firsthand, with everything from going around getting signatures on a get well card, to helping find a lost cat, and everything in between. Sometimes side quests can feel like filler to a game's main narrative, but that's definitely not the case here, and the overall variety of the side quests, combined with the excellent voice acting, really helps to immerse you in the universe much better than the movies ever could. Now, there are other elements to the game, as I mentioned earlier, such as puzzle mechanics and visual novel storytelling, but for the most part, you'll spend your time between the combat and RPG elements of the game. Combat-wise, you start with your trusty Auto 9 pistol, which stays with you for the majority of your journey. And here's a nice touch, in most games, the pistol is useful for all of about 10 minutes of the game before you equip something more powerful. However, in Rogue City, you can upgrade your pistol through the RPG elements of the game, meaning that you can take an already serviceable weapon and turn it into a practical hand cannon. Even in the late game, the Auto 9 remains a good choice thanks to this mechanic. There are many other weapons in the game to use, such as shotguns, rifles, and even heavy machine guns, which all feel good to use, but the weapon which delivered the most predictability, even if it wasn't always the most powerful, was still the Auto 9. Although here's an interesting twist that is either going to be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your point of view. The Auto 9 has unlimited ammo, you literally cannot run out. Now, while this helps to keep the pace of the action high, because you're not worrying about ammo management, it definitely lowers the overall difficulty of the game. As I said before, it feels like at times an on-rails experience, and I think the unlimited ammo is definitely a big part of that. Personally, I would have preferred at least some kind of ammo management system, but your mileage may vary depending on your preferred game style. Another part of the combat I don't think works well is the sniping segments. Remember in the movies when Robocop went around sniping people? Yeah, neither do I, and that's probably one of the reasons it feels so jarring. Robocop isn't a Call of Duty character. He doesn't believe in stealth, he believes in pushing forward like the tank he is. Thankfully, this isn't an overused mechanic, but it's still one that feels odd every time it comes up. On to presentation, and this is a bit of a mixed bag. The environments and overall art style are well realised and do a great job of bringing Detroit to life. There's a good variety of environments here and all feel well designed. However, the character designs outside of Robocop himself are not as detailed as I would have expected, especially from a 9th generation console on PC exclusive. I feel like increased detail in the characters would have amplified some of the more poignant moments in the narrative, especially the Alex Murphy threads. Another thing which I found unusual was a relatively low number of NPCs within some of the overworld hubs, particularly the outdoor ones. I'm not sure if this was a technical or a design decision, but it's a little unusual to see the same amount of people in the police precinct as there are in blocks of open streets. Sound design is exceptional. Honestly, I can't speak highly enough about the sound design. From an incredible soundtrack to very high fidelity effects and exceptional voice acting, every element of the sound design is just fantastic. I'm not going to bore everyone with sound samples because I know people just skip over them, myself included, but just take my word for it, the sound design is absolutely top notch. Now, while the art and sound design are both solid, there are some elements which hurt the overall presentation, and the most frustrating thing is these are all fairly minor things, though when combined dramatically impact the overall experience. We have everything from spelling mistakes to graphical bugs, with perhaps the most serious being the stutters which seem to occur at near random points in the game. Outside of spending time with the PC version, I also played the PlayStation 5 version, and while some of the PC problems don't exist on the PS5, other problems like slowdown even in the performance mode seem to manifest themselves. There's nothing here that's game-breaking or doesn't feel like it could be resolved in the future, but for a full-price title, I feel like there is a general expectation that these issues are solved prior to release. Now, when Robocop was first announced, I was concerned about how the game would turn out, and I don't think this concern was unfounded, because in the last decade, we have certainly had some questionable entries in this space. Even after watching the gameplay trailer, I was still not convinced. It just didn't look like something which would translate into a fun video game. However, my interest in the overall franchise after growing up with the movies was enough for me to give the game a go, and overall, I'm really glad I did. Rogue City's story, while electing to play it safe still tells an entertaining story backed by impressive voice acting and an environment that helps to immerse the player in the game world, all while offering a very satisfying game loop combined with excellent combat and engaging side quests and progression. Perhaps the only downside is that Rogue City's presentation doesn't always rise to meet the lofty ambitions of the game loop. Hopefully in time these presentation challenges can be ironed out, because this is still a good game, and with some further refinement could easily be a great game. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.